record. Okay, so live from Las Vegas. It's a great pleasure to have Professor David Turnbull with us here today in our conversations series. February 10, 2023, beautiful, sunny, gorgeous day in Las Vegas. Winter is clearly over. It's one of those short moments where you are not necessarily needing air conditioning yet, and you don't need heating anymore. So this is a very short, very precious short period environmentally. So here we have UNLV School of Architecture, a number of Master of Architecture students. We also have our old friend, Yasuhiro Imai-san from Tokyo live here, where it is 5 a.m. in the morning. And so, hello. And a great pleasure to have Professor David Turnbull with us. I mentioned earlier, David is a UK-born British architect who has a long-standing connection with American schools of architecture, ranging from Cooper Union to Columbia to Yale to Cornell to University of Pennsylvania, and also in the UK to the AA School and the Bartlett, I believe. So probably all the 10 world top-notch architecture schools are in his bio, and he's doing interesting work with Grow Oyster Reefs, where he's the senior sustainability advisor, but also working very closely with the engineering giant Arup in London, worldwide engineering firm, after having done a lot of work in Africa. And David and I met in 1988 or 89 at James Sterling's office in London, where David had a much longer and much deeper engagement than me. And this is where we also met Imai's son, who is online here from Tokyo, who has been working with us at that time. Wonderful, good memories. So yes. Welcome, David. So maybe over to you. Let's talk a little bit about, born 1957. You studied at Bath University, is this right?
Actually, I'm going to catch you out right there because I'm a teeny weeny bit younger. I was born in 1958 in January, I actually I was going to start my talk today remembering that today one of my favorite architects in Europe died on this day in 1996. And his name was Roland Simonet. And the reason I'm interested by him in this context is that, as you will have seen from Stefan's flyer, I was thinking I would reflect on the meaning of the desert. I'm very interested by the provocation that Stefan gave me, which was that you are all in your final year, I believe, as graduate students. And therefore, like my students here at ASU, who are in their 6th year, you're all, if you are from overseas, you have OPT visas, you have to have a job offer in your hands before you graduate. There are all sorts of pressures. If you're local, you might be considering that you want to move to another place, and that there's all sorts of uncertainty in the air about what the future might bring. The economy is in a very peculiar state at the moment internationally, and all sorts of obstacles present themselves, which presented themselves to me when I graduated from architecture school in the 1980s, similarly into a recession, into a difficult period economically, where the options were either very great or very small, depending on who you were and where you were. I wanted to honor today this architect in France, Simonet, who designed notably in Paris, the Picasso Museum. But he came from Algeria. He came from the desert. He was born in the desert. And so we are, all of us, desert creatures at the moment. I am in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. You're in Nevada. And we're dealing with what it means to live and work in an arid climate, hot, arid climate. And what really has moved me recently, and particularly powerfully in the last few years, and specifically in the last 6 months since I've been in the desert here, is the importance that the desert has as a figure in relation to the history of architecture and what that might mean for all of us as we plan our lives moving forwards. As Stefan knows as much as anybody else, if not more so, the desert is also a place where many of the speculative urbanisms of the past, and indeed of the future, have been and are being planned. It's no accident that the most extreme form of urbanization imagined on the planet at the moment, the line, is in the desert, as the desert meets the water. For me, as somebody who was born in England on an island in a temperate climate, there was something eternally fascinating about the relationship between the ocean, the sea, and the desert. And when I read about the desert stories, and as a younger adult read Raina Banham, Scenes in America, Deserter, and looked at also all of the stories that people were telling about architecture in the desert, the travels of Frank Lloyd Wright, Paolo Soleri, and others, that I realized this was a place that I wanted to be. And for me, an ideal life is somewhere between the ocean and the desert, which actually I have at the moment living in Los Angeles, working in Phoenix. So Simone, who died on this day in 1996, which was also the year that I went to teach at Yale as the Aero Saarinen professor, was a child of the desert and learned about architecture in situations like the ones that you and I are in now. And took that knowledge and his drawings in 1953 to France, to one of the most important conferences in my mind in relation to the question that Stefan asked offline: what is it that makes contemporary architecture contemporary? i.e., what is architecture of this time, of our time, that belongs to us in the here and now? And the architects who came from North Africa, the French architects, with their drawings of informal settlements in the desert and of traditional architecture from the desert regions, changed the conversation about architecture fundamentally in 1953, when the topic of Siam 9 in Aix-en-Provence was habitat for the greater number, i.e. for 100% of humanity, not for the elite, not for the few, not even for a lot of people, but for everyone. And I think that for me, that was one of the most decisive moments in the history of architecture, and one that we need to celebrate and remember, particularly on this day, because it was Simone's drawings that made all the difference at that conference. Not the British, not the Dutch, not the Germans, not the occasional visitor from America, but the French from North Africa, from the desert regions, who changed the way that everybody thought about architecture and thought about its role in space and time, what it was to make modern architecture, what it was to serve the greater number, what it was to make habitat, places for people. And so that for me today is an important day in that regard, is that it is an anniversary of a moment when one of the great people, undervalued people in the history of architecture died, somebody whose drawings as a young architect had changed contemporary architecture forever and has gone relatively unnoticed, but needs to be noticed. And so I thought that was important for today. The other thing that I thought was important from my point of view was that rather than making a slide presentation of my work, which I've done a number of times, and I've actually shown my work in semi-arid regions with designing sustainable schools at very low cost. I've shown that work at UNLV already, and I don't want to do that today. But what I wanted to do in order to start the conversation going or maybe even to bring the conversation to an end, is to start with something that I wrote for the Venice Biennale in 2014. I can either read that at the end. I'd like to do it as a reading if that's okay. But it might be nice actually to start with the conversation with Stefan and then see if there's time at the end. I understand that each of you, or at least one of you, will have the difficult task of watching a video of this conversation and then summarizing what has been said and what does it mean to you. And I will take it upon me, myself, at this moment to make that job as difficult as possible. But at the same time, I hope leave you with some thoughts about what it means to be an architect and why, as architects who are graduating from a school of architecture in the desert, you might choose to stay rather than to go. I believe that Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, and certainly parts of Southern California need you. Parts of Texas need you. And therefore, I think that there is a challenge that I would like to put out to each of you to consider very carefully what your next move might be. And I think that that is really the hidden or not so hidden agenda of this series, is to create the circumstances whereby you make the best decision for your future. And for me, that would also be the best decision for the future of architecture and ultimately for the future of humanity. And that I believe, as I hope I've made clear anyway, that question about the future of architecture for the greater number starts in the desert today.
Good advice to our students.
So Stefan, now you can ask me some awkward questions about my childhood and I will not be embarrassed.
Okay, listen, I think that is very good advice to our graduating students who will be completing their Master of Architecture in May and then join the profession a lifelong, you know, so it's something we are asking every speaker, what advice and why is it now an important moment in time? And you mentioned the move to look at the informal, which the French Africans from Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia triggered at Siam in 1953, and that did not go away anymore. Aldo van Eyck took it on board, teaming up with anthropologists, looking at settlements in Africa, but also it was a revolt against high modernism of Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, which were so much dominating the scene and the discussion up to the 1950s, since the 1930s, and the big, heavy heritage of heroic Bauhaus architecture that said, we are here to change the world. And of course, that looked not so fresh anymore 20 years later. In the 1950s, it was about time to move aside and make space for Team 10, for the Smithsons, and a focus on ethics. As Peter and Alison Smithson said very clearly, brutalism, which was the trend at that time, is not a style. They said it's an ethic, it's an ethical attitude. It's not an aesthetic. Versus Rainer Banham, which believed very much that the new brutalism, the new British brutalism, as he coined it, Rainer Banham, then imported to Japan, by the way, and to Brazil and other places in the world, and also back again to Africa. Very interesting, reflecting back to Africa. It was really an act of form giving. An act of form giving, to again quote Peter and Alison Smithson. And this brings us very much to post-war Britain, a condition that David has studied very deeply and knows very well. I think it's very good to talk about two things today. One is the 50s and what was the situation and what might have been the role of people out of Liverpool, of London, that then moved to the US and influenced architecture education for decades to come. For instance, Colin Rowe, but also the desert, which is a little bit a different topic, which is exciting, fascinating theme for all of us, thinking about all the things that can happen only in the desert and what triggers people to go to the desert to do what they otherwise cannot do. Just think of Donald Judd, the famous American artist, who came to a point in New York City where he couldn't move forward in his work. And then he went to Texas, to Marfa, Texas, to set up there and went to the desert quite consciously away, leaving New York City behind and saying, the desert is the place where I can do what I need to do now. So let's just come back, connect again to, what did it mean for you graduating at the University of Bath? You already mentioned you've been at an educational point there with Peter and Alison Smithson, professors of yours teaching you in Bath, but also Ted Happold.
Yes.
Ted Happold was teaching construction at that time and structures and design at Bath. Can you talk a little bit about what did it mean to you and the early work of the Smithsons? What did it mean?
Okay, well, there's so many questions in there. I started at Bath in 1977. I keep on getting confused about this. I thought it was a year earlier, but people tell me it's 77. At that stage, it was Ted Happold, Professor Ted Happold, who set up an engineering firm called Bureau Happold, was working at Arup on the Centre Pompidou in Paris. His team, his structures division, were the engineers for the Centre Pompidou, working with Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers and co. But he was also working with Frei Otto in Stuttgart. The models of the Mannheim grid shell were being built in Bath. But more importantly than that, as an undergraduate, I had structural engineering lessons from Happold, where he didn't tell us how to do structure as architects, but he showed us weekly progress photographs of construction in Paris on the Centre Pompidou. And then showed with freehand drawings how the structure had been thought about. Equally, slightly later, Frei Otto came to look at the research on the Mannheim grid shell, which I'm sure that Stefan can show you, where there were two models. There was one which was a physical model, which was built upside down, hanging, and with cameras around looking at the stress distribution, load paths through the structure physically. And then in the corner of the same laboratory, there were people working on computers building early digital models in the 1970s of the Mannheim grid shell. And the real grid shell was being built, had been built and was being analyzed retrospectively. So there were three branches of research going on simultaneously, which later, when I was a professor at Bath, we took advantage of, because we recognized that experimental setting, in a sense, established the beginning of digital design in relation to structural engineering and architecture, and the possibility of analyzing structure and form using computers was being thought about for the first time. So there was a shift in the air between analog model making and digital model making, which during my period as a student was being shaped in front of me. Equally, Peter Smithson was a member of the faculty, as was Patrick Hodgkinson, who built an extraordinary housing project called the Brunswick Centre in London, but who had arrived from Cornell, where he had been teaching with Colin Rowe. I actually read Michael Dennis's PhD thesis before it was published. It ultimately became a beautiful book called Court and Garden, which is a very, very important text in relation to the design of cities, residential areas in cities. And there were a whole series of confluences which I didn't understand at the time would be important. And I understand them much more once I'd been in Jim Sterling's office for a decade, it all started to come together. I was teaching at the AA, and then reflecting back on what it had meant to be a student in that crucial moment was that there were all sorts of currents running through thinking about architecture and engineering and environmental engineering as well that that conspired to lead me to a position where my interests are in the overlap between all three disciplines. Stefan may have given you the preface that I wrote for his book on informality, and if he hasn't, he probably will after this talk, but in which I talk about these things and about the thoughts that went through my mind at different stages in my life in relation to the topic of informality and sustainability. There's been now, I would say, probably a period of about 10 years where I have been slowly working through, as one does when you get older, things that then show what it means to have had thoughts when you're 20s and 30s that then do not land in a sense, but they become useful and purposeful much later. And I'm sure that we've all had that. Certainly the Yasu and Stefan, almost certainly that that time is one needs time, which is why I also advocate taking time and encourage students to move more slowly and if they can in terms of transitions through from stage of life to stage of life. I suppose one of the things that I feel eternally grateful for is that I met a lot of the people who have helped shape the history of the second half of the 20th century into the first quarter of the 21st. And actually meeting those people and seeing their buildings and in some cases being taught by them, in other cases simply knowing the work in person, as it were, I feel incredibly privileged. Both Stefan, or all the three of us actually worked for Jim Sterling, and so and Michael Wilford in London, and therefore had a direct experience of picking up red lines and doing all sorts of other things that were part of day-to-day life in the office, but also having rather extraordinary parties and other things which brought other members of the architectural community from London into the office, which happened from time to time. Notably, if a major project had gone off or if a competition had been completed, there would be a celebration which was as close as it was possible to get to the kind of celebration that I hope that you will all have when you graduate, which I would take it is in May this year. And then to get to some specific examples, there was one lecture that Peter Smithson gave, which was not really a lecture, it was a little bit more like this, a kind of ramble through thoughts, without slides, without PowerPoint, without even a chalkboard, in a room with a table and a couple of photographs, just on paper, very small photographs, which he actually didn't show us until the very end, but talked about a trip that he'd made recently to La Jolla in Southern California, preceded by a trip to Galveston, Texas. And in Galveston, Texas, he was struck by the wires that brought power to the buildings crisscrossing across the streets, establishing lines in the sky, making a ceiling to the street. And then later, photographs of the wires themselves, making this aerial sculpture. And then the equipment that they were attached to, transformers and other boxes of kit that were haphazardly arranged on the rooftops of buildings, that allowed him to then have a longer conversation about what it meant to think about servicing of buildings in a sense where the climatic conditions might change in the future. And so the rooftop objects and cable paths manifested as an aerial sculpture fascinated him. The theme of working in the air then continued to La Jolla, to the Salk Institute of Lucan, where he refused to talk about the architecture. Of course, to have one architect talking about another architect's work is probably not so interesting, and he certainly didn't want to get involved in offering a critique of a great architect like Kahn. So what he said did instead was to talk about hang gliding. And he showed us at the end a photograph that he'd taken, actually 3 photographs, of a hang glider ascending from the rock face below the edge of the platform of the Salk Institute, looking over the Pacific Ocean, rising up on thermals produced by the slope and at the intersection of the ocean and the land and the air. So it was incredibly beautiful because this image, which was underexplained, but was very close to a discussion of, and he talked about Tatlin and the constructivist academies, and of Tatlin's glider, which was a hypothetical flying machine, and talked about Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines, and then showed this contemporary image of the heroic figure of Icarus climbing upwards on the thermals at the intersection of the ocean and the land, and climbing on the warmer air, and then navigating carefully in order to land somewhere else, seen from the Salk Institute, in which the Salk Institute provided a frame for understanding the environment in another way. And I found that in terms of the teachers that I had, the teachers that I enjoyed most were the ones that showed less and kind of hinted at things which could then be picked up and taken on to become an idea that we could then own ourselves as young designers, and not be told what to do, but told what to, how, maybe suggested a thought that might be suggested, an atmosphere that was suggested, but not an action. So we had to be responsible for the action and the interpretation, but not, and were not offered examples. Other teachers worked in different ways, where they would ask us to do precedent studies and to understand the past. Peter Smithson didn't teach that way. He taught by suggestion and provocation. Not least sharing via the cleaner of the building in which his office was located, instructions for laying the floor of his office, which was to have the tiles would be laid where no joint would align with any other joint. So there was no place on the floor of his office where there was a grid established of any kind. The lines drawn on the floor by the joints between the floor tiles, which were the cheapest, least expensive floor tiles that were possible to buy, that they were arranged in such a way where no joint would align in any direction. And I always thought that was rather beautiful too, as an idea about formality, informality, design, and constructing the conditions where he felt he could be serene. He could be serene because there was nowhere for his attention to sit in the room, in the junctions of the construction, in the layout of the floor, in the relationship between the table and the walls and the windows, where his attention would sit in any other place than in his own sense of himself, his sense of being in space. Himself as a serene individual was not interfered with by anything else in the architecture. I have thought about that a lot in the last few years, about what it means to make places in which it is possible to think carefully and calmly and quietly, and what the situation demands, that is, in a sense, ultimately within architecture, but also outside of it. And so I think that those 3 examples from that one day, it was literally an hour and a half in my whole life. The wires crossing the street in Galveston, the hang glider rising on the thermals of the Pacific at La Jolla, California, and the non-alignment of joints in the tiles on the floor of his office told me more about Smithson than anything else, and also gave me guidance in relation to the development of my own thoughts about architecture. I then went, and of course, I used to work as a journalist at one point in my life, and I wrote a case study about the School of Architecture that they designed in Bath, and that was published in the Architects Journal. I spent 2 or 3 years where I wrote every other week. While I was working at Sterling Wilford, I would typically write in the taxi on the way to the architectural press, freehand on lined paper, and then it would be typed up by somebody, or Stefan will know this, but Kathy in the office would type up my notes, which had been written on the underground train on the way in, or in a taxi on the way into the office, and then I would go off at lunchtime and submit my copy, which would then ultimately end up on the page a week or so later. So there was this strange kind of undercurrent in where there was a panic whenever David had to get an article finished. Early morning, Karen Wallachek or Kathy Martin would type up my notes, and they would end up in an issue of the AJ sometime later.
Let me ask you, let me just come back to Bath and the Smithsons, because that's interesting. I mean, Bath is not just any place, you know, it's in the southwest of the UK, and it's very famous for 2 things. One is the circus, and the other one is the Royal Crescent. And these are 2 very, very significant Georgian town planning pieces from the 1770s in the Palladian style. Andrea Palladio, Italian great master. There was a period in the UK when there was the Palladian period when UK architects copied Andrea Palladio's work. And you can see this in Chiswick Palace and many other places. Christopher Wren and many people were influenced by Palladio. So, I mean, the historical place that the forward thinking happens sometimes, you know, it's very intriguing. And then, you know, you have also, of course, the influence of other places like, let's say, Glasgow and Liverpool, or not only Colin Rowe, but of course, James Stirling, who met when Stirling was a student in Liverpool. Colin Rowe was a very young lecturer there, and this became a lifelong friendship. And then, of course, Colin Rowe moving on from Liverpool to become a Texas Ranger, one of the famous Texas Rangers. I believe there were 5 architects called the Texas Rangers, including John Hajuk and
Werner Seligman.
And so, I mean, that's another important architecture history piece. And then, of course, ending up in Cornell as the professor of architecture there, where he kept in touch with James Stirling. And James Stirling was around the same age, but he was a very controversial British architect. He was a great innovator. James Stirling was the great innovator of formal language, the way he reinvented formal language at the burst time of postmodernism, with at the moment in time when the people like Hans Hollein, Arata Isozaki, Michael Graves were looking for new solutions, and of course then Charles Jenks writing about it. And so the great innovator, completely fearless man who died in 1992 tragically, but influenced by the architecture of the docklands in Liverpool, and the big buildings down on the Mersey River, by an classical architect called Thompson, who you can see so much influence. But also when you go to Edinburgh and you go to Carlton Hill, you see immediately This is the language that Jim Sterling knew very well about growing up in Scotland, but also combining with modernism. Very, very interesting moment in architecture. What does this mean to you? I mean, look, this didn't have anything to do with sustainability at that time. We didn't even know the word. We called it green architecture or eco architecture, but this was really something different. We were much more interested in the formal language that James Sterling invented, and that's what drew us to working with him.
Yes.
What did it all mean to you? Palladio, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Liverpool, all those places you know very well.
Well, yes, I do. My first job at Sterling Wilford was as one of the site architects for the Tate Gallery in Liverpool in the Albert Dock, in a building designed by Jesse Hartley, cast iron columns, very, very beautiful vaulted structure. And we turned it into an art gallery in a very straightforward and simple way. It was a very, very important experience to go up and down between London and Liverpool for me. Also, nowadays connecting back into that history of the importance of the Liverpool School of Architecture in the just before, well, during, and after the Second World War. Jim Sterling was a paratrooper. Many of the architects of the immediate post-war generation, the important architects, had served in some way in the Second World War. There's an entire generation of people who narrowly missed the war itself, but were still conscripted and had jobs to do, often in the Royal Engineers, so they were working directly with architectural and engineering skills. For me, I would say the experience, I lived in the Royal Crescent actually as a student, and at number 5 on the top floor, which at the time in the late 1970s was almost derelict. The windows were broken, the toothpaste would freeze in the winter, and very often things weren't working quite as they should. Now it's one of the most desirable places in Europe, if not the world, to live. But at that time it was not. And as a student, so I had the opportunity to wake up every morning and go and walk out of the front door of number 5 Royal Crescent and walk through the circus and do a walk which is described in practically every history of the city, whether it's Lewis Mumford or whether it's Siegfried Gideon or Sybil Moholy-Nagy or whoever. There are images of that sequence of spaces from Milsom Street in Bath up Upper Borough Walls through along Upper Hill, through the circus, around the circus and up to the Royal Crescent and then beyond, and then also further uphill Lansdowne Crescent, which I lived in as well, which was more Baroque, with a view across the city. And much more complex curvature, which then gets picked up by some of the architectural historians in relation to even the work of Alto later and others. But what I learnt with my feet was, in a sense, the history of the city, and whether this history sponsored speculative thinking in relation to architecture itself, I don't know, except that Bath was also a place where there was an incredibly good rock festival in the 60s and 70s, the Bath Festival, which was also at various times an epicenter for speculative performance art and experiment. It was like the Woodstock of the UK. Most important for me was the realization, and I think this is also what is important in relation to Sterling, is that in my life, I grew up in a village on the south coast of England with Roman oyster beds in the estuary. I went to the nearest town, which was a Roman town in plan, with a Cardo and a Decumanus. A crossing within at the center, a 17th century market cross, a medieval cathedral, and a Roman plan. A place which during the Claudian occupation of Britain had been an important marketplace and also a military base, and had existing ruins of Roman palaces, but had fundamentally had a structure which was in some senses eternal in relation to the history of the city. And whether we knew we were talking about sustainability or not, we were certainly in the 1970s and 80s talking about urban design, particularly those people who had come from Cornell, where Colin Rowe and Oswald Matthias Ungers were having lots and lots of fun disagreeing with each other, but really agreeing on fundamentals. Ungers went from Germany, from Cologne to Cornell. On Colin Rowe's recommendation, Colin Rowe is a Brit, as Jim Sterling's tutor, also Robert Maxwell, another critic's tutor at Liverpool. Both people became very influential in relation to Anglo-European architecture and Anglo-American architecture. And at Cornell, the relationship between the Germans and the Brits and the Americans flourished into something which became a discipline of urban design ultimately, and still actually a foundational set of principles in how one makes cities design streets and squares and meeting places that was formed in the late 70s, early 80s, and came into what was otherwise a modernist school of architecture at Bath through the thoughts of Patrick Hodgkinson, who'd been at Cornell, and Ed Jones, who would then ultimately go off to build Mississauga City Hall that Stefan can show you, which was an extraordinary city hall building in Canada in a new town, where the jury chair had been, or rather the most significant voting member of the jury had been Jim Sterling. And so there are all sorts of loops that went round and round and round, little circuits within British architectural culture, in which fearlessness, I'm not sure is quite the right expression, but there was something to do with a complete willingness to experiment and try things, and also to have as the absolute rock bottom underpinnings after the first three red tile buildings of Leicester, Cambridge, and the Feburary building in Oxford, the History Faculty building in Cambridge, the Leicester Engineering building with Gowan, and the Feburary building, residentials building in Oxford, a period of deep immersion in the questions of the future of the European city, not least because Sterling and then Sterling Wilford entered competitions in Germany, in competition with significant German architects like Ungers, like Kleihues and others. Thinking about the future of the city.
Extraordinary times, yeah.
Yes, and what that means is, and what it means is that, and this is where I think sustainability is a funny word, is that what's really at stake, which is why I started with the principle set out by those architects in Aix-en-Provence in 1953, was how to build decent places for people, for the greater number of people, non-discriminatory, democratic places in which political speculation was expected, in which disagreement was as important as agreement, and those places tend to accumulate around an idea about a city or cities, and the city is the sustainable figure par excellence. And so any speculation about the future of the city is also a speculation about sustainability, resilience, and everything. Whether it's formal or informal, for me, doesn't matter. What matters most is that the underpinning idea is that there is something which we could still recognize as a city, and it's not a European city anymore, as it was then, but it is an important figure in relation to how one thinks about being an architect. And then the environmental circumstances in which those cities are built really matters in order to provide comfortable a comfortable situation for the maximum number of people, whether that's Masdar in the Gulf, or whether it's Bath or Edinburgh in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, or whether it's one of the colonial settlements in the United States in the South, which ultimately becomes a successful commercial city in the late 20th century, and then is that there's an idea, and that for us who are working in the Sun Belt, there are all sorts of challenges about what it means to build a city. What's the right density? How do you get around? Can you walk? In such incredible heat, is it possible to walk from one place to another? That makes our everyday experience valuable and allows us to make our design decisions in a healthy and better way. That the collective idea of a community, however it's framed, and from my generation, it's been called all sorts of different things because people were uncomfortable about the word community or the word sustainability. So we invent new words, or we change them around. So it's resilience and it's solidarity. But ultimately, it's about how people get together, what they do, how they talk to each other, how they connect with each other, which is also why the pandemic was such a difficult period for many of us, was that we were suddenly shown what it means to not connect in the way that we had grown accustomed. And my position is very similar to Giorgio Agamben's, which is that there is a technological conspiracy that compels us to do things like this, where I talk to you through a little tiny window on a screen, and I'm not sitting with you in the room, and then we go out and have dinner together and exchange ideas, which are arguably going to be more interesting over dinner than they are now. And I think that we are now recovering from that loss. My hope is that becomes an opportunity to rediscover the pleasures of communality and interaction in a deeper and more profound way that will then lead us to design cities in a better way, which is where Stefan comes in, because that's his job.
And yours.
His mission, and mine, yes, but it's our mission. It's our mission,
yeah.
And one that we share. And that's where, and I believe that Sterling in particular, intellectually, was, and Tony Vidler, in his Unpacking the Archive, looking at Sterling's work, went round and round and round. I mean, as a historian of typologies, or a typological historian, or a historian as a type, and a type of historian, and Tony Vidler was completely committed to the principle, which is that there are always beautiful continuities of space in which people can gather in every single project that Sterling designed, from his thesis as a student all the way through to his death.
I always advise all my students to study Sterling's plans and sections, because
Yes.
there is so much to learn from just looking at the plans, the line drawings, and the sections of Big Jim. And you mentioned Big Jim's extraordinary work of the 3 red brick buildings, Leicester, Oxford, Cambridge, of course, Florey student housing in Oxford, 1971 is my favorite. Those 3. Leicester is fantastic. It's very
Yes.
and almost shocking. The least is Cambridge History Faculty Library. I think that's different. That's somehow not as provocative as Oxford. Just look at the structure of Oxford housing, unbelievable. So I think it's very, very interesting to open up the discussion. There is also in the chat a question from Bijan. But just before we do that, I mean, also we could talk more about the AA school, the role of the AA school in the 70s and 80s. You know, the future belongs to those who innovate. Very clearly, and this was the hotbed of innovation in the world at that time in the 70s and 80s. But also, we mentioned earlier, not only Colin Rowe, but Rainer Banham had such a strong position later as an eminent professor of architecture history in the US, another UK import, and coming over from London. And he, of course, had a love of the Mojave Desert, and a famous trip he did in the 70s, 72 and 74 from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, just around that time that Robert Venturi and Dennis Scott Brown discovered there is something special about Vegas. And you can learn as much from Vegas as you can learn from Athens or Rome, was one of the claims. So what do you think about living in Los Angeles? Coming back to Rainer Banham, who loved Los Angeles. He loved to drive around in his car. He even made a movie about it. Rainer Banham Driving in Los Angeles is the name of the movie that came out in the 70s. And he has this old Ford and he drives around the freeway, up and down Santa Monica and up to the hills and so on, and he describes what he loves about Los Angeles. Very, very interesting movie. What is it like for you to be living in Los Angeles, which is such a car-dependent, non-sustainable system, of course?
Well, Banham was very important to me. When I was a student, in order to get books out of the library that I wasn't allowed to get, I faked a library ID card where I called myself Rainer Banham. And I had a friend who was a librarian, and we put this thing together so that I could get things from the research collection out that couldn't otherwise. I then lost my library card. It fell out of my jacket in Rome in an elevator. And so Rainer Banham, also me known as Rainer Banham, is on an ID card from Bath University in 1978, sitting at the bottom of an elevator shaft somewhere in Rome at this moment. I found, as probably everyone of my generation in Britain found, Banham utterly fascinating, not least because of his beard. And his hat, and his bicycle, that he cycled everywhere, and he was very proud of that. He worked at the architectural press and was photographed famously outside the architectural press offices in Queen Anne's Gate at about the same time that he was also photographed by Tim Street Porter on the same molten folding bicycle, whatever it is, cycling across a salt flat in the desert. And that photograph didn't go viral because we didn't have that in those days, but it would have done had it been the present day. And in fact is now one of the kind of canonic photographs of that period, where Banham, who loves LA, as the movie will say, actually hated where I live because he said it was full of plastic people with plastic boats and it was disgusting, and he really hated what was happening to it and on the Marina Peninsula because it wasn't LA. Nowadays, that's not quite true, but Banham didn't draw me to Los Angeles specifically, although I read his book, Los Angeles, the architecture of three ecologies, I think. 4 ecologies, sorry, I'm mixing it up with Felix Guattari's 3 ecologies. And also I later read Scenes in America Deserta, which I really liked a lot, not just for the descriptions and the kind of descriptive text, but actually for the pieces, fragments in italics between the chapters that are more like dreams. And there was something about Banham, which was that he was not afraid of all the fearless people there were, who kind of somehow ended up between Britain and America. Banham was one who was really not embarrassed about anything. And that was incredibly admirable from my point of view, because I suffered acutely from shyness and embarrassment, and to see examples of people who didn't was amazing. I went to LA for the first time in 1988 as with Jim Sterling and Michael Wilford for the Walt Disney Concert Hall competition presentations. went to Rebecca's in Venice, which had been just recently finished by Frank Gehry, and the Edgemar precinct, which had just opened with the first Ben & Jerry's ice cream store west of the Mississippi. And I fell in love. Went back to LA periodically, and then after the pandemic, decided that I just reached a time in my life where I would just move there and to hell with it. Whether it was Banham or whether it was Disney or whatever it was, and whether it was sustainable, I didn't care. I just wanted to go and be near the ocean and do the thing that English people do, which is to get away from the weather and get away from the British political situation, and find themselves somewhere that Anthony Hopkins, the actor, likes because it's light and it doesn't impress you with, it's not overburdened with history. And yet nowadays, one could argue that it is, but it is nevertheless a lot lighter and a lot warmer and a lot easier than the situation back home. And so I did it. I tried for 1.5 years to live in LA without a car, which is possible with a bicycle, 2 wheels and pedals in Venice and Santa Monica, because most of the things, grocery stores and everything else, are within walking or cycling distance. It's not, however, possible to know LA without a car. And as Banham said, he had to learn to drive in order to read Los Angeles in the original. Where he says that, I can't remember, whether it was in the book or whether it's in the film or whether it's somewhere else. But he learned to drive. He did not know how to drive. He learned to drive when he was invited to teach at UCLA, I believe, in order to read Los Angeles in the original, because he read the city. He was reading the city.
I didn't know that he didn't have a driving license. That's interesting, because he became such a fan of the possibility, the freedom to drive around alone in a car at night in LA. I also want to refer, make a big plug on my book, Transatlantic Engagements. I don't know if any of you, do you have that, David?
I've got a copy, yes.
Okay, which talks about many of those transatlantic engagements between Europeans and American architecture schools. Also talked about the battle between Oswald Matthias Ungers and Colin Rowe at Cornell later. So very interesting. We spoke about many different aspects, extraordinary memories that are really relevant when you think about 1970s, 80s, 90s architecture, the end of the last century. There is now, if that's okay, I can refer to a chat question here that Bijan posted. Can you delve deeper into how the North African architects influenced the Europeans and how they helped change the view of architecture?
Yes.
How they helped changing.
Bijan, are you there? Can you, no, hang on a second. Not there anymore? Or there? Anyway.
He's there. He's right next to me in the gallery.
Okay. Oh, there you are. Sorry, I will address you directly. I think, well, I went to Paris a lot at a certain period in the last decade before the pandemic. And I had a reader's card for the National Library, mainly because I wanted to go and read in the reading room designed by Henri Labrouste on Rue de Richelieu, which is in the second arrondissement. Beautiful reading room, and I wanted to go and sit there. When I was in Paris, I wanted to sit there, and but I discovered that the more interesting place to be was actually in the book stacks in the reference collection at the back in the Art History Archive. And this is a very, you may have realized that I tend to be a little bit circulate around the question, but I want to provide some context. which is that in May 1968, as you may know, there was a student rebellion in France. There were other rebellions by students all over the world for all sorts of very important reasons, not least wars in Southeast Asia and problematic conflicts in the world where colonial tensions produced circumstances where major powers decided to step in. But in May 68 in Paris, during a sequence of events called the events, the Les Événements, the architecture students and students at the Sorbonne and in the École des Beaux-Arts rebelled against the way that they were taught. And what was so important about that moment was it was also coinciding with the tail end of the decolonization process, which was actually still underway in many North African countries and sub-Saharan countries, which had been colonized by the French, the Italians, Dutch, and others, Belgians, others, British. And my childhood was marked by decolonization because in the village that I grew up in, people came back who'd been posted in Ghana and other countries. And I now go back to work in Ghana and Kenya and Nigeria with the work that I'm doing, building schools. But those students rebelled against the way they were taught. And what happened was that the Beaux-Arts system was dismantled and then reformulated as a set of distributed units around the city of Paris and also throughout France. All the books in the library disappeared or were taken by their professors out to wherever they were going to go. And so the national collection was very severely depleted, and I got very interested by this. I wanted to know what had been taken and what had been left out. And I discovered as I was reading more and more, because I'd grown up in England and I'd been taught that Team 10, the modern movement in its transitional period in the 1950s, that the British and the Dutch had taken a leadership role. And that was the kind of orthodox wisdom as far as I was concerned, and as my generation of British architecture students were concerned. What I discovered in the book stacks at the French National Library, in the books that were missing, rather than the books that were there, in the copies of journals that were missing, rather than the ones that were there, in the journals that I knew existed because I'd seen them in the library that I was in England, but couldn't find in Paris, that there was a story to be told, which was a much, much more interesting story. And it is covered by Jean-Louis Cohen and others, sort of talking about the emergence of a new form of modern architecture in Casablanca, in Morocco, in Algiers, in the later stages of French colonization and in the decolonialization period, that there was something really remarkable happening where French, Moroccan, French, Algerian, and Algerian architects in particular were looking at the way that the cities were forming themselves in the waves of migration from one part of Africa to another, to the Mediterranean, and then ultimately in the late 60s across the Mediterranean and back into France. The number of mosques that were built in France increased exponentially in the early to late 1960s and early 70s, for instance. There are all sorts of things to do with community patterns in Paris that changed radically. And so I realized that there was something wrong about the story that I'd been told. And that the French had been rather reticent about telling their side of the story, and has allowed Alison Smithson in particular to become the post facto kind of guide through the history of late Siam, Team 10 and beyond. And then the Dutch, Dirk van Hervel and others in Delft, picked up that history, and with their website, Team 10 Online, tell an almost exclusively Anglo-Dutch, German-Dutch, English kind of narrative about the formation of the transformation of modern architecture from the 1950s through until the end of the 20th century. And I haven't done this because actually Jean-Louis Cohen is doing a wonderful job, and PhD students associated with the program in Paris and at Columbia are doing a lot of work to recover the story about what happened in North Africa in the 50s and 60s and what that means, and the late 40s, and in the period after the Nazi occupation and the Vichy period in the Second World War, where the French collaborated with the Nazis. And so there's a post-war history which is being written now, which repositions North Africa and North African architectural culture in relation to the development of paradigms which were more pertinent, more useful, more helpful in relation to present day, I mean now, 21st century questions about how housing, how habitat is made, how housing is provided for the greater number in all of our cities. I actually have students here in Arizona looking at residential patterns defined by ATBAT, which was spin-off supported by Le Corbusier, Candilis and others, looking at patterns of patio housing, high density, low rise housing for 21st century urban situations. I think that there's a very, very, very interesting story to be told. And Simone and others did some very, very interesting work looking at mat building, carpets, patio housing, Terrassenhauser forms that were very, very, very beautiful and incredibly useful because they were sensitive to and measured, that's the most important thing, measured the situations that were being built in an ad hoc way by people migrating from one place to another, becoming more sedentary and finding places to put things. And then learnt from that situation in order to make a better circumstance, possibly, maybe not, but I believe possibly, for a greater number of people than housing pattern provided for in earlier iterations. And so I see that period as being incredibly important in relation to the situation we're in right now. There's a chronic housing shortage in many cities in the United States. There are patterns of migration. There are disasters happening as we speak on the border between Turkey and Syria, in which, because of poor engineering, buildings are collapsing. And because of a poor understanding of the engineering of settlement, the architecture of the design of places that is clearly inadequate and leads to catastrophic circumstances for a very large number of people. And I think we have an obligation to learn again from some of those experiments from the mid-20th century that didn't necessarily lead to an answer that was viable at that moment. But as we all know, those provocations, their time comes. And I believe that there is a moment now where some of those lessons of the desert are applicable to everyday metropolitan design decisions across the world that don't need to be compressed into a single line running for miles across the desert. But
which is the project you mentioned earlier in Saudi Arabia, the line.
Yes, which could lead to more intelligent, peaceful ways of organizing the pattern of living that actually, oddly enough, have a lot in common with that floor tile laying instruction that Peter Smithson gave to the floor layer. Say, make sure that no line goes through from one tile to the next. It's no accident that I think it's in Ordinariness and Light, it may not be, it may be in another book, but the Smithsons wrote about the maximum length before there's a change of direction in an urban texture is 300 feet. Now, I don't agree with them, and I think there are plenty of examples where that's silly, but there are also plenty of examples where it's a pretty good idea that 100 meters, 300 feet is some kind of metric, a walkable distance before you change direction that allows for a rich complexity of experience while at the same time allowing for large-scale development patterns. And as they found in Bath, and actually they learnt from Bath in order to get that 300-foot metric, because the only street in Bath that is longer than that is Milsom Street. All the other streets change direction at or within that 300-foot dimension, which is really fascinating. So there's sustainability in practice, which is, who knew that a sustainable urban plan might be organized according to a metric that's learnt in Bath by architects who learnt from North Africans?
Wow. So are you referring to the influence as far as community living and resources and just
Yes.
being more okay?
Yeah, but also structure. Sorry to interrupt, but in 1952, Jorn Utzon, who went on to design the Sydney Opera House, advised a young architect called Sverre Fehn and a friend of his called Guy Grung to go to North Africa. And Sverre Fehn got a traveling scholarship and went to North Africa and then wrote about it in Byggekunst, the Norwegian magazine, edited by Christian Norberg Schultz, in issue number 5 and 6. If you've got it in the library, we don't have it here in ASU, but it exists. And it's a beautiful narrative by Fehn with his photographs, and tells a story about his following doing what I did when I went to work in Egypt, which is actually following in my case, it was following the Bedouin to find out where the water was. I went with Fred Coter, who co-wrote Collage City, and we went walking across the desert between Cairo and Suez, following this guy with a camel, who had an intuitive understanding, or rather the camel knew where the water was. And so we could trace the future pattern of a town by following the Bedouin. What Sverre Fehn did was he met some young people, one of whom was called Muhammad, and he wrote Muhammad's story, and included actually photographs of people in this, which is unusual for an architect to actually go and actually engage, meet people, name them, and then say what they learned from this child about architecture. And that then became very, very important to Sverre Fehn's architectural career, that experience in North Africa really defined his thoughts for the future, which was then the source of another essay, which was a poetic essay with photographs and drawings, which was published in 1953, I think in issue number 7 of Byggekunst, which I've just had a conversation here at ASU about a student journal, and I said to them that I'd like them to go away and come back to me next week, but they think about this phrase, which was Grung's phrase at the end of his article, which was, architecture will be discovered fishing for iron mountains in the desert. Now that was something that was a poetical expression that was informed by a trip through the desert in North Africa by a Norwegian architect and his friend. After a year of reflection, the end result was that architecture will be discovered while fishing for iron mountains. And I love that idea. It's about structure, it's about form, it's about a relationship with life. It's about discovery, but it's also active. It's to do with fishing, and so, which is, as anyone who fishes recreationally will know, a hopeless task, but at the same time incredibly exciting when you catch something. And so these two architects went fishing in the desert, where of course there's no water, and found iron mountains, where of course there are neither mountains nor iron. But what it did was it summarized something about what it is to make architecture. And it's in those two issues of Biggerkunst, which were actually conveniently bracket the Aix-en-Provence CM9 meeting, where Christian Norberg Schultz and the Norwegian group Pagon went and made a presentation, which was not as well received as any of the others, and perhaps could have been if they'd allowed some of these young people who'd been in the desert to actually have their voice, because they knew afterwards that the French North Africans had something important to say. The Norwegians knew more than anybody else.
I want to clarify that what you just mentioned. When they were coming, and your favorite one of your favorite architects, Roland Simonet, during those times in the late 60s, maybe it was early 70s, when they were coming to Europe.
Yes.
Was it known at that time that they had a different way of looking at community building materials and structure, or was it now discovered years later, the influence that they had, and they're trying to fill that gap in history, as you say?
No, I think it was known. There were a number of battles that were going on particularly in France, in the period after the decolonization, not least the Algerian tensions, which were, well, the evidence of them still going on to this day. But I would say that there were also other battles going on between the concrete industry and the steel industry. Simonet, actually, the North African architects who came back to France after the decolonization period ended up doing a lot of housing. And they did housing because of the insights that they'd gained in the 50s. And so in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and in the 1980s, there was a lot of really good social housing that was built in France by people who had learnt their trade in North Africa. Now, whether that's a good thing or not, because of course it's embroiled in colonization and colonial politics, that's a question. Whether some of the motifs are caught up in cultural appropriation from different cultures, that's a question. But at the same time, I don't know, my ethical position is such that if something is useful and it works well, do it. If it doesn't hurt anybody, and in fact, if it makes a greater number of people's lives better, I'm not sure I am as concerned about cultural appropriation and the predicament of decolonization as maybe I should be, but I am very, very interested in things that work. When I was very early stages of working on the water bank project with Pitch Africa, the nonprofit I used to run, we went to see Peter Singer, who is an ethicist who teaches at Princeton, and asked the question about whether it was better to work. The rhetorical question was, would it be better to get funding from Pepsi Cola or from the Department of Defense? And he said that you have to work out where you put your line. But from his perspective, to work with military funding was a lot better than working with Pepsi Cola funding, because Pepsi Cola are one of the biggest polluters of water supplies around the world because of the way they wash bottles, or did at the time. and their employment practices were not so credible either in relation to developing an ethical position. Whereas the military was absolutely crystal clear about what it did and how it did it. And therefore you could take a position. And also, in terms of delivering water to disadvantaged communities, there was an intelligence that the military had that Pepsi-Cola Corporation did not have. On the other hand, you could go to a remote outspot in the Himalayas or in a mountain range far, far away and find, as I did, in a refrigerator, a bottle of Pepsi-Cola, which has been delivered by camel or horse or whatever. The reach of the corporation is immense into every aspect of global life, which is not true of the alternative scenario. And so there's the ethical predicament. Do you go with the people with the best supply chain and logistics, or do you go with the people who have a very clear agenda? Because the best supply chain is also one of the greater polluters. So you take a position. And I take the same position in relation to intellectual predicaments in relation to why we make architecture and how we think about it, is that I'm probably at base utilitarian, and I like things that make a difference. And my purpose, like Stefan's, is to make a difference to a greater number of people, and to do that with a certain amount of grace.
We have a fascinating discussion, especially Africa is so interesting, you know, end of colonialism. And then today, nobody thinks much about Algiers because they are so embedded in their own struggles. But Algeria, Egypt were the cutting edge at that time. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they had this unresolved revolution, and a couple of very interesting architects emerged. For instance, there is the architect Hassan Fatih, mm-hmm. and he knows the work of Hassan Fatih in Egypt very well. And, yes. And then there are, of course, French architects that went there. Like now, today, we would go maybe to China to build, or to Saudi Arabia now, and to be involved, like Morphosis and Euler and yes. Tom Wiscombe are all involved from Los Angeles in building that evil project Line, the Line. Neom, some say it's the future, some say it's evil in Saudi Arabia. At that time, the French architect, because it was the same language, everybody spoke French in Algiers. And so Candelis Jossig Woods, very, very important firm at that time from Paris that had an office in Algiers, Candelis Jossig Woods, but also others like Jacques Lucan, very important. And then soon after, Bernhard Rudowski making an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1964 called Architecture Without Architects.
Yes.
Looking at the patterns of settlement, and I spoke recently in a lecture about that to students, I believe. But anyway, so there we could talk much more about that. A lot of names were mentioned today that maybe you heard the first time, Sverefen, Norberg, Schultz, and so on. Very, very important people of the last century that have coined architecture in their own ways. And it's all very much interconnected, of course. And this interconnectedness of debate and protagonists and pioneers and emerging trends only becomes clear later as you are concerned for a longer period and you study it deeper. You find that the same people reappear again and again. Louis Mumford was mentioned, Rainer Benham, and so on and so forth. So we have a wonderful discussion here, and nobody knows the intricacies of this discussion better than David Turnbull, because he's been meeting those people in the last 50 years in different places in the world and working with them and so on. So fascinating discussion. Are there any other questions, any other comments, David, you want to make before we have to?
I would just like to say I'm very grateful. I'm sorry I was late at the beginning. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do this. I didn't get to read my text, and so I will send it to Stefan so you can read it.
Yes, I forward.
And also, I think that my preface for the informality book also covers many of the questions that I raised today.
And I gave 3 copies to the library. We have the informality book in the library. Yeah, it's got the preface by David in my recent book, Informality Through Sustainability. Yeah. So
I think that the next time we get a chance to talk, we can take one of these threads and see where they take us. So and so I'd like to say goodbye and thank you, Stefan. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, David.
And I will see you soon, I hope.
Thank you.
And all the best. Stop